Hello, everyone. Actually, this is the MiDiGo webinar series, the first one, October 2022, and we invite Professor Dr. Ayhan Kaya from Istanbul Bilgi University. Actually, he will today he will talk about populism in remote places. But before, I would like to give a small biography of him. Actually, Ayhan Kaya is professor of politics and also he is Jean Monnet Chair of European Politics of Interculturalism, and he works nowadays at the Department of International Relations, Istanbul Bilgi University, and he is also focused migration issues and cultural diversities and Europe and migration stuff, Islam and West. So all these topics, and is also focused populism in the current studies. And we would like to talk about this tema today. And please, Professor Kaya, you can actually today you share with us populism in remote places, how we can understand populism in
Yeah.
our current age. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulash. I know we have a limited time, so I'll try to focus on some of the findings of my two different research projects. One is radicalization of European youth, which is a ERC, European Research Council, advanced grant research, and the other one is another ongoing research uh, called Matilde. It's an Horizon 2020 research, and it looks at the impact of migration in remote places. So, in this presentation, I will basically talk about these two research projects, and let's see what we have. Let's see how it has been actually discussed in uh, yeah in different places in the European context mostly. So I approach populism from a rather more anthropological perspective. And as you know, in the current European context, right-wing populist people are mostly being considered, perceived, labeled as extreme nationalists, extremists, and they are often called a bunch of Nazis, fascists, etc. But I think this is a rather misleading way of looking at these people, because in the field we know that we are facing a lot of people who are mostly living in remote places, former agricultural production lands, mountainous places, away from the big cities, cosmopolitan, metropolitan cities, living in small towns which were previously working class populated regions, districts, towns, etc. So we see that there is a very clear cut socioeconomic deprivation, political deprivation, nostalgic deprivation, and psychological deprivation, especially among some groups of people who live in these remote places, which are believed to be neglected, which are believed to be forgotten by the political center in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, in Amsterdam, wherever we are talking about. So this is why it is very, I think, important to focus on the different ways of deprivation that these people in remote places are facing. That is why I think ethnographic research, anthropological research is very much important to really understand the sentiments of these people instead of putting them all in the same basket and labeling them as extremists, fascists and Nazis. This is actually often the case when the centrist European mainstream political parties are looking at this is how they define these people for their own electoral gains. So if you take a look at the different ways of understanding populism in the current context, we see that there are three different schools looking at the root causes of right-wing populism. I don't have time to get into a detailed explanation of these different schools, but I have given the main references here. One is anti-globalization approach, the other one is anti-elitist approach, and the third one is an approach that reads populism as a kind of political style. You can use all these different schools interconnectedly, eclectically, to understand what is going on, let's say, during the Brexit era in the UK, or you can try to understand what Le Pen is talking about in the French case, or what Wilders in the Dutch case is talking about, or what the AfD is talking about or promising in the German case, and or lately what the Sweden Democrats are saying in the Swedish context. So I personally, appreciate what the third school is telling us because it teaches us that populism is a kind of political style that is followed by all the right-wing populist political leaders. So there is a very, large literature on this. I take populism as a form of radicalization. And also, I know that the term radical is not really appreciated very much. The term radical is perceived to be equal with extremists or sometimes terrorists, sometimes fundamentalists, sometimes these extremist kind of people. But it seems to me that we forget about the etymological roots of certain terms, the terms that we used to use a lot in the past, in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And when you look at the literature on radicalization and radicalism, you see that there is, over the last 300 years, you see that there is a really large literature on radicalism. I mean, for instance, Craig Calhoun in 2011 made a very nice classification of different forms of radicalism. We had philosophical radicalism. Marx was a radical. Protestants in the 16th century were radicals. Reformists in the European context were radicals. René Descartes was much earlier radical. So we also had some tactically radical people. Post-colonial people were radical. Sometimes revolutionary people were radical. Yellow jackets of France were radical. I mean, here, tactical radicalism includes some violence. But what is really essential for my own readings, for my own analysis of the current forms of populism is this what we call reactionary radicalism. Sometimes those people who are subaltern, excluded, neglected, socioeconomically deprived, psychologically deprived people who are trying to express themselves against the destabilizing effects of modernization and currently globalization tend to express themselves using some ethno-nationalist discourses, sometimes conservatism, sometimes religion, sometimes right-wing populism, sometimes Salafism, sometimes other forms of expression. So I think that currently what we see as right-wing populism can be expressed, can be explained as a form of reactionary radicalism. But if you allow me, I just want to make a separation here between those people who support the right-wing populist parties on the one hand, and the right-wing populist parties themselves. I mean, I have no problem in, let's say, naming some of these radical populist parties as sometimes neo-Nazi or extremists, but I find it problematic to put the followers of these populist parties into the same basket, because they are individuals and they have their own problems, and they only have certain, different ways of expressing themselves in a way. So here, I think what is essential is to try to understand the ways in which they try to express themselves. And here comes the intervention by Charles Tilly. According to historian Charles Tilly, we express ourselves with the tools that we can pick up from our own cultural repertoire. We are cosmopolitan people, we have a different cultural repertoire, but those people living in the remote places who are not mobile, physically not mobile, who are not really educated, who are lower educated, who are unemployed, who are excluded politically, socioeconomically, etc. And those people have different tools in their cultural repertoire. They may have ethno-nationalism in their repertoire. They may have culture, religion, past, heroisms of the past. Sometimes they may even have violence in their repertoire. So it all depends on what we have in our cultural repertoire in terms of the things, the tools that we pick up to express our selves. So, with this background, what we see in the European context lately is that many people following the right-wing populist parties are becoming more and more Islamophobic, not because they're literally Islamophobic, but I think they are becoming Islamophobic because Islamophobia has become a mainstream kind of ideology, mainstream kind of form of governmentality, so that people know, such people living in remote places know that if they use Islamophobic, discourse, they will attract the attention of the people in the political center in Berlin or in Brussels or in Amsterdam, elsewhere. So it's a rather strong discourse. But when you scratch the surface, when you talk to these people, you realize that they don't really talk that much about Islamophobia. They don't really talk that much about religion or similar issues. But they rather try to tell you, they rather try to communicate with you to express themselves that they are really tired of this feeling of being left behind by the political center, left behind by the bureaucrats, left behind by the cosmopolitan politicians, cosmopolitan media experts, etc., etc., because these people have their own local concerns, which need to be resolved with local interventions in a way. It is also interesting to see that they quite often complain about discrimination, alienation, and humiliation in everyday life. They are being humiliated when someone calls them neo-Nazi, when someone calls them fascist, when someone calls them racist. Of course, they may have racist elements in their discourse, but this is not a way of communicating with the people, with the electoral sources in a country. So they want to be heard, they want to be listened, they want to be respected, they want to be reached out to. And they argue that the political center, the mainstream political parties, are far away from lending their ears to them. So apparently there is a lack of communication between these people living in remote places and the political center. That is why they are becoming more and more appealed to anti-systemic political parties. At the moment, when we look at the European political sphere, what you see is the right-wing populist parties as the representatives of these anti-systemic political formations. And of course, refugees and the migration, mobility of a lot of migrants in the EU or from the outside the EU, and especially of the Muslims, we see a prevalence of this discourse of invasion of Europe by Muslims, which started in France with the polemical intervention of Camus, and then it is becoming more and more prevalent in the other parts of the European Union countries. So if you follow this kind of thinking, we also realize that it is not only the socioeconomic and political deprivation that these people are going through, but they also go through a kind of nostalgic deprivation, what we call in populism studies. Nostalgic deprivation is simply a kind of feeling that is expressed by these people in reference to this, to the glorious past that they knew, that their forefathers, foremothers, foreparents knew and talked about. But when you look at the European context at the moment, so many of these people complain that France is no longer the same, Netherlands is no longer the same, Germany is no longer the same as they knew, or Sweden is no longer the same. It has become too diverse. It has become too complicated to grasp, to understand. And let's not forget about the fact that we are talking about mostly immobile people who were born in certain places and probably who have never left those places. So our worries about the European Union at the moment, or in about Europe in general, are far different from their worries in their everyday life. So that is why they kind of celebrate the past, the heroisms of the past, as a response to the flows of globalization, which change their everyday lives, which change their homes, which kind of shake their truths. So this is a kind of reflection, what they show, what they demonstrate in order to express themselves, because the present is very disturbing. If the present is full of warriors, then the future is even more worrying. Then in this case, if the present doesn't pay off for these people, if the future is even more worrying for these people, then past becomes a very precious source of content for these people. And the right-wing populist parties are very well aware of this. This is why the right-wing populist parties always play with the past heritage, heroisms of the past, and they always use figures like Jeanne d'Arc in France, Queen Boudica in the UK, Roman history in Italy, or Hellenic past in Greece, or Ottoman past in the Turkish case. So these are the main source of deprivation, which makes the myths and the past very essential, both for the followers of these right-wing populist parties as well as for these right-wing political party supporters. And I wanted to underline here that there is a really large literature which touches on the growing relevance of the past to be used by these people. Just in the last part of my intervention, I just want to give some voices to the people whom we interviewed over the last couple of years. For instance, here, someone from Dresden, when we talk about this 29-year-old unemployed male interlocutor, he basically talked about some of the remnants of the Second World War, and apparently, according to him, Second World War was a kind of conspiracy produced by the Western powers against Germany. So this is quite actually interesting, because This shows us that one of the problems of, let's say, Dresden or former East German provinces is that the young generations in these provinces did not really go through what we call Vergangenheitsbewältigung process, which means the coming to terms with the past process, which was not the case in West Germany, because all the West German citizens went through this process, but the former Eastern states citizens did not really go through this process. So apparently there is a historical element here which needs to be taken into consideration. Another important intervention by one of our interlocutors in Dresden is reminding us, is telling us that, well, there is still an ongoing kind of contestation about the reunification of two Germanys in the 1990s. Apparently, there is still an unresolved issue among the former East German citizens of today's Germany, and they still complain about the asymmetrical relationship between East and the West. They still complain about their perception that East Germany has now been colonized by West Germany. And if you look at the figures, I think these figures are really worth mentioning, because at the administrative levels in all sectors, in politics, in business, 70% of the administrators, high-level administrators in the East German provinces at the moment are of West German origin. So this is the thing that they often, explicitly tell us to express their feelings of discontent, feelings of kind of deprivation. When you look at the interlocutors in France, we made interviews mostly in Lyon, Toulon, etc., where right-wing populism is really strong. You see this very common trope among all the interlocutors, that France is lagging behind. France is no longer that country anymore in their eyes, which promoted égalité, liberté, fraternité, which kind of exported civilization to the rest of the world. So apparently they believe that, they see that France is no longer the same as they learned from their parents, from their from the earlier generations in a way. If you look at the case in the Netherlands, we conducted the interviews in the Bible Belt in Rotterdam, which is a really interesting landscape where many of the interlocutors complained about the diversity, super diversity, which something that they cannot really digest, it, they cannot really cope with. So there is this understanding that their culture, their homogeneity is being challenged by the global forces of capitalism in a way. And finally, if we go to Belgium, we did the interviews in a region which is very nearby Brussels, called Denderstreek, where Vlaams Blok is very, essential and very powerful over the last 10 years or so. You see that there is a really interesting concern about regionalism. They want to protect their region against Brusselization in a way, because they complain about the people coming from Brussels rising their rent prices. They're also concerned about the others, mostly Muslims, who are in a way disrupting their homogeneity, etc., etc. So these were some of the testimonies of the people that we interviewed. This shows us that there is a kind of civilizational paradigm which has become very dominant over the last 2 decades since 9/11, and I think that civilization rhetoric is still there. And there are some people who really complain about their feeling of being forgotten, being kind of neglected. And this civilizational rhetoric, I think, is a very fertile rhetoric for all kinds of political and societal and cultural polarizations, which divide us which divide the societies between us and them, and the divide between us and them are is mostly expressed through these civilizational terms. And unfortunately, civilizational terms are simply being reduced to cultural and religious differences. So this is the fertile land, this is the fertile context in which right-wing populist parties are becoming more and more mainstream, using the civilizational rhetoric to a great extent. They are no longer extremists because they are also using the welfare discourse. They are using from time to time environmentalist discourse, left-wing discourse. So this is why it is a rather misleading way to simply call these parties as extremist right-wing parties, because they're also taking the support of former left-wing working class people. So this is why we need different ways of interpreting the rise of populism in Europe, and we need different ways of interpreting what is going on in the European context. And as a way of concluding what I said in this presentation, I think that right-wing populist people are in search of new communities of sentiments. It is quite interesting to see that many of the right-wing populist party supporters are not really coming from pious religious people. They are coming mostly from secular, agnostic kind of people who are in need of new communities of sentiments to hold on to feel safe, to feel stronger. And in this context, because of the socioeconomic deprivation, nostalgic deprivation, political deprivation, it is these right-wing populist parties, which are anti-systemic parties, offering these protective shields to these people to make them believe that they are the ones whom they should support. We see that they are using immigrants as a tool. They are using the Muslim invasion of Europe as a discourse. They are using the civilizational discourse to a great extent, and they are using the nativist rhetoric to a great extent, and they are using this welfare state rhetoric lately as a way to appeal themselves to their followers. And also recently, it is also interesting to see that these political parties have become even more mainstream, because they also appeal not only to working class people or agricultural rural people, they also appeal to middle class people using this Islamophobic form of governmentality. And this is why they are appealing themselves to the women and even LGBTI groups who complain about their way of being treated by the Muslims in general. So this is why right-wing populism is, in a way, mainstreamed itself, using very successful forms of political communication strategies. So this is what I have, Ulash. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, that was a great webinar today. Actually, we should, as you know, our project, Migration, Diversity and Governance, and I think we should take our lessons from your webinar, especially mainstreaming populism, actually very critical in migration studies and migration management, we can say this, and also diversity issue. Especially you underline the conservative tendency actually in terms of preserving national identity and nativist rhetoric. So I think this is a very critical issue. And thank you for these European-wide research. Actually, that's very brilliant, and we should more focus on your findings. Thank you, Professor Kaya.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yep.